Joining me. So this is going to be a follow-up presentation on two bar charts that we released this week on the history of Canada's federal debt. These findings have caused some people to react emotionally, to deny the results. So we're going to go into how we came to these findings, why these findings are important, and we're going to look at some other issues pertaining to them. But that's our purpose tonight. You know, we take pride in our research at NCA. A lot of times we do our own calculations so we can empower the Canadian public. We believe the stronger the Canadian citizens is, the stronger the country will be. So that's the foundation of NCA. That's our approach. We're fully opposed to the Lib and Con establishment. We realize over the last 50 years it is off track. It's on a globalist agenda. It's radically transforming this country. We stand in full opposition. This isn't all about Trudeau or the Liberals. There's a deep state in Canada, establishment, Lib and Con. Look at the Privy Council, the shadow government in Ottawa that shadows whoever's in power. Look who's on the Privy Council. That'll help you. But I'm going to go into these charts here, and it's important that people operate from the realm of factual reality rather than misperceived beliefs that are not based in fact, that are based in rather than in spin or misinformation. We operate from the realm of facts and what we call truth. And that's what these bar charts are, 100%. And I will show how we calculated. And we challenge you, if you disagree with these findings, you go do the calculations. You tell us where we went wrong. So the first graph is right here. I'll just go back here. Just give me a second. It's right there. So this graph, it's a history of Canada's federal debt, PM and party, and it's from April 20th, 1968. This is when Pierre Trudeau first came to power, to January 11th, 2020. So this was just done a few days ago, 5 days ago. And we didn't go into 1967 prior because the federal debt was very low. It's only once Pierre Trudeau got in and then subsequent governments, regardless of which mainstream parties in power, the debt just exploded. But from this period, 1968 to 2020, Mulroney has almost 50% of the total debt. This is 44.72% of the total federal debt since Confederation. Harper came in at 17%, followed by Pierre Trudeau at 14.42%. And then Justin Trudeau at 13.32%. And then Chrétien at 6.8%. And then it goes on from there. But these are factual findings. There's a myth in our society by these spin doctors, these mainstream spin doctors. Doesn't matter whether it's Lib or Con, but in this case, let's look at the cons. They perpetuated a myth that they're fiscally responsible. The data shows that they are not fiscally responsible. And second, they are less fiscally responsible than the Liberals. I wouldn't even call either of them fiscally responsible. They're both fiscally irresponsible. And the Conservatives, based on the facts, on the data, they are the most fiscally irresponsible. Period. But that's a spin in the political domain. It's a lie, it's misinformation. It's manipulating you and your family. We're calling it out. This second graph looks at it overall. So from 1968, April 20th, when Pierre Trudeau first came to power, to January 11th, 2020, during that period, the so-called Conservative Party added 65.5% to the federal debt, the total federal debt since Confederation. And it was around 463 billion of your tax dollars into debt, which is great for the banks. The Liberals came in at 32.48%, less than half of what the so-called Conservatives added to the federal debt, at 229 billion. Combined, during this period, they brought in 97.98, the Lib and Con establishment, since 1968, of the total federal debt. This is a fact. These are facts here. And I will show how we calculated them. But isn't that horrendous? This is when Canada turned for the worse, when Pierre Trudeau came into power. But it's not just Trudeau and the Libs. The Cons are probably more guilty for what's going on and their ties to banks, globalist entities, the globalist agenda. They're all in on it. You can see it in the data right in front of you. Right there. This is the Lib Con deep state establishment. They're working for banks. They're working for globalist interests. Canadian people are coming last. This is resulting in massive debt service payments to banks. It means your taxes are higher and you have less benefits and services from the government. Every year it keeps growing. So how do we calculate these numbers? It's very simple. You can do it at home. You could do it at home and fact check us. So here's the national debt clock. Thank you to taxpayer.com. But you can put in whatever date you want. I can we can go right to 1968. April 20th, right here. That's when Pierre Trudeau first came in. So we know what his starting place was. The debt was just over 14 billion. So then we can go to the end of his term and find out the difference. And then he was in again in the late 70s to 1984. So we can track the amount of debt that he added, the Liberals added while he was in. That's easy. That's all there is to it. And we can go here. This is on the Government Canada website. We can look at each ministry and find out exactly when they came in. December 12, 2003, Paul Martin. And he went to February 5th, 2006. So we can know exactly the debt that they added. We put it into the debt clock and we come up with our calculations. And this is the reality right here. So we ask you to own this. Don't deny it. Don't get all emotional because it's challenging your beliefs. But this is a factual reality. Let it become part of your belief now. And what it shows, as we mentioned, the so-called Conservative Party is more fiscally irresponsible than the so-called Liberal Party. Both of them are fiscally irresponsible. We would argue criminally. We're not taking sides here because we believe the Lib Con, they're just one entity. They're just represent the establishment, the deep state in Canada. They're just kind of front organizations. So I want to talk about, this is a good article. I'm just going to talk about it briefly. But this article is by Dr. Kaufman. He's the one who did the study on the demographics in Canada. He was projecting by 2100, traditional Canadians are going to drop to less than 20%. Beautiful work by Dr. Kaufman out of the, I believe it's the University of London, but look him up. This is an article that he published recently in the Political Quarterly, but he makes some good points here which ties into this. Down here on page 1, he talks, quote, in our collective attempt to make sense of more divisive issues, they point out how academics, students, and others can fall prey to two unhelpful cognitive reflexes, which cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, warns against. The first one is dichotomous thinking, namely the tendency to divide the world into a binary good, us versus evil, them. And the second one is, the second cognitive reflex is catastrophizing, namely the belief that if something does or does not happen, then things will end in disaster. So these two cognitive limitations, we would argue, are at play in the Canadian realm, without question. The first obvious dichotomy, archaic dichotomy, left, right, liberal, conservative, just playing people back and forth. And then there's attack on so-called far right, alt-right, versus everyone else. You can see these dichotomies at work. In terms of catastrophizing, the most prevalent example going on is climate change. This is being used as a fabricated existential threat to help bring about global world order, liberal international order. It's designed to create fear and propel people into action to create this order. It's a fabricated catastrophe, the outcome of so-called climate change. Another one that is going on in certain circles is Trudeau, how if he's in another term, it's going to be the end of Canada, etc., etc. That's just, we don't buy into that. Trudeau is just part of the Lib and Con establishment. He's replaceable. Whether he's in there or not, there is a deep state behind there. Remember that. Don't get caught up in these dichotomies. We don't support Trudeau one tiny bit. But we're not going to get lulled into thinking it's all about him. Remember the data I just showed you. Why would we think it's only Trudeau? Look at that. And this article makes another point I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to read it out here. Right here. In the world of Bloomfield, this is kind of a cultural Marxist academic, lefty academic, Bloomfield. Of all these writers are aligned with far-right analysis, having adopted its language and terminology. They have brought into this binary divide, the choice is either neoliberal hyper-globalization or a patriotic nationalism. Are we to tar all these writers as Nazi fellow travelers who rail against this way of seeing the world? Unfortunately, that's not where the data leads, etc., etc. But the point with that is they're attacking anyone who challenges the liberal international order, aka global world order. But from NCA standpoint, it's good to simplify when it makes sense. And we agree with that basic dichotomy, the neoliberal hyper-globalization versus patriotic nationalism. In our opinion, that's all that matters at this stage. And that's what's going on. Hyper-globalization ties into a Harvard professor, international political economist, who talks about hyper-globalization and how it's harming the global economy and nation states. Another thing to keep in mind, people who don't accept factual reality, we call this cognitive dissonance. I want to be very clear what this term means. It's a state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes, especially as relating to behavioral decisions and attitude change. So when people look at our graph, we present the facts. It's irrefutable what we're presenting once we show how we came to it, where the data came from, etc. Yet people are still in denial. We call this cognitive dissonance. They have beliefs, attitudes that perhaps it's only the liberals and Trudeau. But the factual reality, which we're presenting, they're inconsistent with their belief, but they're unwilling to modify their belief, their attitude. So they have cognitive dissonance. Their beliefs and attitudes are not corresponding to factual reality, and they're unwilling to make them consistent. So they get emotional. They start lying, and they don't provide any data. They cast doubt. But we've seen this. But it's important to operate in the realm of factual reality. So keep an eye out for cognitive dissonance. This is it must be a bad place to be, because your beliefs are out of touch with factual reality. So either you're a troll or you've been completely programmed, misinformed. So try to have an open mind. Keep your mind open to different facts, different ideas. And before I finish off here, I want to present this calculation we did. Some of these people with cognitive dissonance that we come across, they try to argue that the conservatives were in power when there was a downturn or recession, and the liberals were in power when things were good. That's why there's all that debt. This is what we've been getting. This is part of the spin and misinformation. But let's think about this logically. If that were the case, let's assume that is the case. How does that justify all that debt? 65.5%. You would think in a downturn recession, you would have tighter controls on expenditure. Yet these so-called conservatives are trying to justify their expenditure during a downturn. It does not make sense logically. But we actually fact-checked that, and what they're saying is a lie, a complete lie. And here's the data here. So we looked at Justin Trudeau, Stephen Harper, Brian Mulroney, Pierre Trudeau. These are the main culprits, for the most part, regarding the massive federal debt owing. If we look at Justin Trudeau, He's been in around 4 years. During that time, there was an average GDP growth rate of 2.07%. So we're looking at the GDP growth rate as an indication of whether it's a downturn, recession, whether things are booming. That's why we're doing that. During that time, total Fed debt added $94.2 billion. And that's nothing to be pleased about. That's gross fiscal irresponsibility. But $94.2 billion, and the percentage of the total federal debt was 13.32%. If we look at Stephen Harper, he was 10 years in office. The average GDP growth rate was 1.71% during that time, and that's a little down from Trudeau. He added $120.2 billion to the federal debt during that time. 120.2, and he's at 17%. If we look at Brian Mulroney, he was in 11 years. He had a higher growth rate during that time, 2.5%. He added $316.2 billion to the federal debt. $316.2 billion. And his claim to the federal debt is 44.72% as of January 11, 2020. Pierre Trudeau was in 17 years. He had an average GDP growth rate of 3.7%. He added $102 billion at 14.42% of the total GDP, total debt, I should say, federal debt. But isn't it interesting? Brian Mulroney added triple what Pierre Trudeau added in 6 years less. And he almost did the same with Harper too. But look at those numbers. But we dug deeper. And during Harper's reign, there was a downturn in 2009. The growth rate at that time was minus 2.9%. But it was only during 2009. It wasn't throughout the whole term. And that's why his growth rate during that whole period was 1.71. And if we look at Mulroney, there was only 1 year where there was a significant downturn. It was in 1990, minus 2.1% GDP growth rate. And if we look at Pierre Trudeau, in 1982, there was a significant downturn, minus 3.2% GDP growth in that rate. But those are the only 3 years that we identified as significant downturns. So the argument that the Conservatives are in during recessionary downturns, sorry, it doesn't hold water. It's misinformation. Complete misinformation. If anything, Pierre Trudeau was in during the worst period, 1982, minus 3.2%. So keep an eye out for the misinformation. But there it is right there. There's your growth rates. There's not much separating Justin Trudeau and Stephen Harper in terms of growth rate. I will point out Justin Trudeau's spending. He's going to eclipse Harper if he continues. He's expected another $94 billion, so that'll bring him up to $180 billion. So we'll see what happens. We don't support either of those establishment parties. The records speak for themselves. They are fiscally irresponsible. Both of them. And historically, up to now, the Conservatives have added more than double to the federal debt since 1968 than the Liberals. This is a fact. They are the most fiscally irresponsible to date. Period. That's it. And we're not here attacking, but it's important to understand the history and not get caught up in that's all about Trudeau and the Libs. There's a Lib Con establishment. In the Privy Council, they all work together. These are just front parties of the entrenched establishment, deep state in Canada. That's all they are. That's all they are. They spin. They don't have real discussions like this. You're not going to see this in the fake mainstream media. They don't want you to know this. They want to create an illusion of difference between Lib and Con, when in fact there is no difference, because they're just extensions of the establishment. That's it. So this is just a fabricated separation. It's like red and blue. Has no meaning, but it's a way to distinguish those two. And they try to say Conservatives are fiscally responsible more so than the Liberals to create some kind of difference, when in fact there is no difference. So get informed and check out NCA at www.nationalcitizensalliance.ca. We are true populist, nationalist federal party. We support all Canadians coast to coast. The globalist agenda is impacting every single Canadian. It's not tailored to one province or two provinces. It's across the entire country. The only way we're going to take it on is uniting patriots across the country.